you, Minister Xu Xieyuan. Thank you, Professor Gordon Houlden and Gordon. Thank you very much, and for setting such a great stage for the discussion on many of the issues that we're going to talk about in the coming two panels. I'm really inspired by your candid dialogue exchange of views and talk about democracy and the Taiwan issue, which will be addressed in the coming panel one, and then later when you pick up the question from the audience about climate change, trade issues, and all those issues will be addressed in our panel two. So we won't have a coffee break, so I'm going to ask Gordon to kindly continue to chair panel one on the U.S. Strategic Rivalry in the Biden administration. Gordon, back to you again.
Thank you very much, Nong. And I'm going to introduce the speakers in order. I'm going to introduce them as before each person speaks. So we'll start with the first, Michael Swain. I may shorten the biography slightly. You have reference to them in the material. He's the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is one of the most prominent American scholars of Chinese security studies. He came to the Quincy Institute from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he worked for nearly 20 years as a senior fellow specializing in Chinese defense and foreign policy, U.S. China relations, East Asian international relations. He has served as a senior policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and is as written and published a great number of volumes and articles. He is currently directing, along with Ian Johnston, a Canadian, I would note, of Harvard University, a multi-year crisis prevention project with Chinese partners. Please, Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon, for that very generous introduction. And thanks to Hong Nong and to my friend Wu Shicun. It's a pleasure to participate this year, again, in the ICAS conference. Despite how difficult the bilateral relationship becomes, it becomes ever more important, in my view, to have these kinds of discussions. Now, what I'll speak on is strategic rivalry in not just the Biden era, but the Biden-Xi era. To discuss strategic rivalry, it really helped to try to understand what the term means, something that few people actually do. I view strategic rivalry as a contest between two or more powers to gain a decisive and sustained advantage over the other in the domestic and international use of four fundamental determinants of security and prosperity: military power, economic strength, political order, and social health and well-being. In this context, each side regards the other as a de facto adversary, if not enemy, vying to dominate its rival in these four critical areas, especially as they relate to its own vital interests. Such a strategic rivalry is precipitated and driven by the adoption by both sides of these kinds of enemy-like images of the other. The rivals can be seen as, the other can be seen as territorial expansionist, imperialistic in some ways, or as a peer competitor, either now or potentially in the near future. Now, unfortunately, the Sino-US strategic rivalry, by and large, fits this sort of definition, in my opinion, and it has elements of most, if not all, of these enemy images, if you will. Unlike during the early stages of the Sino-US normalization process, most perceptions of what the other side was and or rather today, what the other side is and what it is attempting to do as a truly threatening strategic rival are now taken by leaders and analysts on both sides as being in some way self-evident and axiomatic, and in no need of clear confirmation and description, when in fact, in my opinion, they need just that. Now, there is no doubt that the US and China are competing in some critical areas of national interest over relative military power, almost entirely in the Western Pacific, over certain norms or rules in various global regimes and agreements regarding human rights, limits on the principle of state sovereignty, governance norms in international development assistance agreements, digital standards, and over certain views of the relationship between the government and the economy, as well as competition over international status and prestige as exemplars of good governance, for example. At the same time, the depth or importance, scope, the operation, and the ultimate threats to one another posed by such competitions remain open to considerable debate, in my view, for at least two basic reasons. First and foremost, it remains, in my view, unclear whether each side sees the other as implacably committed to gaining some kind of near permanent and destructive advantage over oneself, hence requiring an equally implacable commitment to opposing such an outcome in various zero-sum ways, or whether each side believes it can in fact shape the intentions and the politics of the other to move the rivalry in more benign directions, even on some major issues of contention, or even to end it entirely in some ways by, for example, using appeals to mutual interests and positive sum solutions to deal with common pressing problems, as Susan alluded to, such as climate change, probably first and foremost, whether exercising restraint and showing a willingness to compromise in ways that can build some level of trust and at least non-worst case thinking on both sides, which we've also spoken about. And then by providing durable, credible, and concrete assurances to strengthen existing essential understandings between the two countries, in particular over the question of Taiwan, as we also just heard. Now, a second reason that the nature and extent of Sino-US strategic rivalry remains open to debate, in my view, is because despite some poorly grounded beliefs to the contrary on both sides, neither nation currently presents a genuinely existential threat to the other, militarily, economically, or politically. In other words, the rivalry is not over national survival per se. And so this should make compromise and some level of risk-taking in offering initiatives easier to undertake. Now, currently, neither the Biden nor the Xi government is internally examining, as far as I can tell, with any care, the nature, scope, and malleability of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. Both are holding untested assumptions that fall on the pretty extreme end of a spectrum for all kinds of reasons: political, ideological, bureaucratic, and historical. And neither side is seeking to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the other and with other major powers, not only about the nature and extent of the strategic rivalry underway, but more importantly about how to preserve overall global order, prosperity, and well-being despite that rivalry's existence. Each side is myopically focused on its own interests vis-a-vis the other, competing more broadly, largely over how to influence the views of others in their bilateral rivalry, and of course, how to undermine one another. The Biden administration has thus far, in my view, shown no real interest in fleshing out its simplistic tripartite slogan of competing, confronting, and cooperating with Beijing. It claims to be conducting a China policy review, but there's no evidence of it yet. As we all know, the administration is deeply influenced by US domestic politics. And in my view, it can't afford politically to engage Beijing other than to, quote, call it to account, or while saying it wants to create guardrails, quote unquote, for its intense competition, quote unquote, in the global, quote unquote, global power competition. It uses all these slogans constantly. And the administration apparently thinks it can merely trot along, building ever closer relations with Taiwan, because China won't dare do anything serious about such actions, at least before the 20th Party Congress next year. Well, what then, one wonders? The Biden administration apparently thinks it first needs to build a grand anti-China coalition with other nations before actually dealing with Beijing in any substantive manner. Hence, we have the Quad, the Summit of Democracies, the AUKUS agreement, multiple trips by senior US officials to Europe and Asia to rally the troops, and importantly, efforts to get other nations to support its pushback stance regarding Taiwan, most notably Japan. But none of this is producing concrete, substantive, coordinated outcomes that serve to do anything but deepen the security competition, reinforce vociferous trends and anxieties in Asia, and in the process undermine efforts to deal with the truly existential threats we all face. Now, in the meantime, the administration has also done next to nothing to alleviate the costs placed on US workers by the Trump tariffs, or strengthen its economic presence in the region and in regional and global economic and trade bodies, or even to consider whether it might have been a mistake to opt out of the CPTPP. Actions, all of these actions, or lack of action, taken for domestic political reasons, in my opinion. Now, let me end with a few comments about China. I'm sorry to say that Beijing is not doing any better than Washington in defining the nature, scope, and depth of its strategic rivalry with the US. Officially, it rejects the very concept of strategic rivalry as Cold War thinking, even though many Chinese scholars openly acknowledge, if not endorse, its existence. Beijing instead says that it's engaged in a near altruistic search for a deeply cooperative, positive-sum, non-contentious international system based fundamentally on globalization and on what looks like goodwill and strategic partnerships with just about everyone. And yet, in many ways, the Xi Jinping government does not act as if it believes much, if any, of this. In areas such as cyber commercial espionage and influence operations within the US and other countries, it engages in very active, often illegal activities that can be described most charitably as the product of a kind of dog-eat-dog outlook, especially regarding commercial espionage. Even if true, that is, even if the US is doing the same to China, this in no way reflects Beijing's public posturing. Now, one could say the same thing about other areas of Chinese foreign policy. For example, China appears to be creating closed digital systems in many BRI countries that do not look like win-win outcomes to outsiders. All of its loan arrangements are very secret, more so than existing standards call for, and are designed to disproportionately benefit Chinese companies. And of course, internally, China is putting into place more state administrative and ideological controls over businesses. None of this sounds win-win from a global perspective. Moreover, it increasingly seems to adopt a petulant, angry, and sometimes petty stance in response to what it sees as various injustices, thinking it is just responding to the bullying anti-China policies of others. Although China's reputation in many developing countries remains pretty strong, with some notable exceptions, its image has dropped greatly in developed countries as a result of this behavior, along with various types of nefarious Chinese influence activities. So how to improve the situation? I'll end with this. Unfortunately, domestic politics and to some extent ideology and a tit-for-tat attitude play an oversized role in preventing both countries from taking a close, hard look at their rivalry, and on that basis, defining with concrete examples where it is damaging, or if possible, could actually be benefiting both countries, where it is disproportionately favoring one over the other, and most importantly, how it can be shaped and moderated through what possible actions, including the reaching of understandings on critical drivers of rivalry. Until each capital takes such a close look at its own policies and priorities and then engages with one another in this way, we will continue to stumble along and, in my opinion, increase the risk of a future serious crisis, probably over Taiwan. Yes, what this needs is bold, risk-taking leadership, as Susan said. And to take that first step is going to be a big one, but I think both countries need to do this in a really meaningful way. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you also for remaining close within the time limit, which will allow us some time for questions and interactions a bit further on. It's now my pleasure to introduce Drew Fung, the director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies for the South China Sea and professor at Nanjing University. Drew Fung was formerly deputy president of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies and professor, School of International Studies at Peking University. He specializes in East Asian regional security, power relations, and maritime security in Asia Pacific and North Korea's nuclear proliferation issue. He's widely published. He also is on editorial boards of scholarly journals, consults independently for the Chinese government and the private sector, and is a frequent commentator on television and radio and in print, and both Chinese and foreign journals, and particularly on security policy. Please, the floor is yours, Drew Fung.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. It's truly my big pleasure to join such a remarkable assembly of our panelists for a very, very timely discussion of what is going on with the U.S.-China relations. I think Dr. Swain also made a very strong point on how just how to look at or examine the bilateral relations and what some sort of just to underpin the current tensions, and most importantly, where it might just hit on. So from my perspective, I see strategic competition between the U.S. China now is really just a start to unfold. For most of Chinese, we consider such a very dramatic, devastation, or in other words, it's a turning around of Americans' foreign policy towards China. It's really out of some sort of preparation and imagination, because we consider President Trump was a bigger driver for disengagement of the policy vis-a-vis China, because the former President Biden was a very hawkish, Republican, we say conservative. So during his campaign and his presidency, so Mr. Trump always just say, or always just flouts, what's the China? China is stealing Americans' technology. China is just making use of Americans, market openness. China robbing the U.S. of the working opportunity. So then that's why the China is just growing. And in other words, U.S. just not just benefiting from the interactions from China. I see the 4 years of President Trump administration really just imposed not just some sort of such a strategic complication, strategic competition to the China, but I think the pandemic almost become almost last straw to crash down our bilateral relations. Last July, the former Secretary of State Pompeo also declared the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is the most formidable enemy to the democratic world. He also just very desperately and very awfully just wanted just inflaming Chinese to stand back up against the CCP's governance in China. I see this kind of speech is really unequivocally to some sort of we say new Cold War declaration vis-a-vis China. So then it also just back the Beijing into the corner. But we say last year probably it's a very, very special, because Trump administration not just trying to bash the China from its very, very conservative idea and conservative position, but most importantly, the former President Trump just want to take the China as some sort of back passing. He wanted to shift all the domestic file to his very failure in response, combat, the COVID pandemic, and over to some sort of such a China-based, just a disaster, inflicting to the United States. So then, yes, the Trump administration, almost just one term of a presidency, but it just we also very, very, badly see the bilateral relations just fell into the lowest point. On the other hand, we see there's a couple of potential, some sort of explosive, the domain where the both sides probably will be very dangerously got into the collision course. Taiwan issue, when it's just become some sort of the new, tasting ground for the both sides. I think it's completely just to start off from Trump's very desperate, China bashing posture. Unfortunately, after the President Biden came to the power, we consider some sort of such a legacy from the Trump administration always remain just unchanged or intact. One is change the policy narrative vis-a-vis China. So what's the China? China is not just an authoritarian. China is a stealer. China is explorer. China is some sort of, we say, a liar. So then I consider in the past more than 4 decades, no such a moment could be just easily just figured out to match what now the Americans' political society and policy society just view the China. in such a very negative terms. Then second is, we also see some sort of domestic politics now is become a leading driver for President Biden's China approach. Actually, President Biden from the beginning was a poor, weak, the president. He's also president in crisis. So he desperately and intently want to get his China policy become so hawkish, so harsh, to facilitate his some sort of popularity, earning. Then we also see less than 1 year. I think some sort of a weaker presidency of President Biden. Also, well, now just how say very, very definitely lead to his some sort of, we say, hawkish, high-profile, rivaling gesture vis-a-vis China. So tomorrow there will be a World Democracy Summit, because it's just less than 1 month from the two leaders, virtual summit meeting. Then just a couple of days, the White House also declared a diplomatic, the boycott to the Beijing Winter Olympic. So traditionally the dealing between Washington and Beijing always could just based on some sort of a mutual respect to what's the Chinese, habits, what's the Chinese, some sort of a virtuous, the thinking on the bilateral relations. In other words, Chinese pay a lot to some sort of facial factors, but now, such as some sort of Chinese familiarity is totally disappeared. So let me come to my conclusion. I see strategic competition is normal, but the problem is, if some sort of such a China policy will be very exclusively based on Americans' domestic politics, that will be very misleading and also very risk-taking. For example, I also see Taiwan issue. So then, yes, Chinese believe we also have to respond. But from Americans' perspective, they consider American came to the Taiwan's defense just because the China intend to overtake or overthrow the status quo. But the problem is how such a mismatch could be eventually resolved. Then we will see every time such a high-level negotiation just going on, it was just how a restaging of exchange of the words, exchange of, it's some sort of restaging the war of the words. So then I see such a domestic politics now become a very intervening factor to get the relations less just approached in some sort of a possible and expected way. So then my view is that in one way, such a domestic factor could be really very carefully broken down and facilitating both understand. It will become some sort of a new factor to reframe our relations if we will want all such a potential risk could be erased or controlled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew Fung. And also for staying roughly within the time frame, I turn now to Robert Sutter, professor of the Elliot School of George Washington University. He is professor of the practice of international affairs. He also has served as director of the school's main undergraduate program. His earlier full-time position was visiting professor of Asian studies at Georgetown. His government career saw service as a senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service, the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific of the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council, the China Division Director of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. PhD graduate in history and East Asia relations from Harvard. He has published many books. I turn to you now, please, Professor Sutter.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today, and I appreciate the invitation. And I've learned a lot thus far this morning about many different things. My focus is on the agenda item of the conference to forecast the likely trajectory of U.S.-China relations over the next year. And I'm looking at the U.S. side of this situation, judging that our colleagues from China will give that perspective very well. And looking at the state of play in Washington and looking at domestic politics and domestic affairs in the United States that were just mentioned and what impact they have. And so my basic point is why U.S. rivalry with China will endure. It will endure, is my judgment. Let me just, I prepared my remarks. Let me just recount them for you. The remarkable negative shift in American policy against the Chinese government behavior now dominates U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific region, one of the two top arenas of acute U.S. rivalry with China. The other is competition for dominance in the high technology industries, determining which country will be the world's economic and military leader. This assessment, my assessment today, demonstrates why this fundamental change in U.S. policy will endure. American domestic politics drove the sharply negative turn against Chinese policies and actions. China's ever-growing challenges to a wide range of American interests eventually prompted a shift in China policy among leaders in Washington that emerged in public view with the Trump administration's national security strategy of December 2017. The shift emerged erratically with divisions within the administration and President Trump vacillating unpredictably. However, bipartisan majorities in Congress proved much steadier in countering China's challenges. Public opinion and Democratic presidential candidates led by Joseph Biden were not supportive of a tough approach to China until a turning point came with a strong and broad American disapproval of China's government behavior as the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States during the presidential election campaign of 2020. Both Trump and Biden emphasized toughness toward China at that time. What are the China challenges seen from the U.S. point of view? The overall driving force behind American resolve in dealing with China has been a well-supported understanding within the administration and among broad bipartisan majorities in Congress. They see clear and serious challenges to the United States and many other countries posed by the headlong drive of the authoritarian Chinese party state for ever greater wealth and power at the expense of others. First is the challenge posed by over 30 years of rapid development of Chinese modern military power, tipping the balance in the Indo-Pacific, supporting Chinese territorial expansionism, and undermining U.S. alliances and partnerships in seeking dominance in the region. Second is the challenge posed by China's similarly long-standing use of state-directed development policies to plunder foreign intellectual property rights, undermine international competitors. They involve state-directed economic coercion, egregious government subsidies, import protection, and export promotion, using highly protected and state-supported products to weaken and often destroy foreign competition in key industries. China recently seeks dominance in world high technology industries and related military power, displacing the United States and securing China's Asian and world leadership. Third is China's challenge to global governance. More than any other major power, Beijing leverages economic dependence, influence operations, including elite capture and control of important infrastructure to compel deference to its preferences. In the Indo-Pacific region, these practices are backed by intimidating Chinese military power. In this way, China seeks to legitimate predatory Chinese economic practices and territorial expansionism, to oppose efforts promoting accountable governance, human rights, and democracy, to oppose U.S. alliances, and to support egregious disruptions of Putin's Russia and other authoritarian and often corrupt world leaders. So what's the outlook? The Biden administration's tough approach to China is now well established in key areas, including the Indo-Pacific and high technology competition. The waves of bipartisan congressional legislation countering China prepared over the past year are starting to pass into law. They will add greater U.S. resolve to counter China's challenges. President Xi Jinping shows no let-up in major challenges to America and its allies and partners, posing often stark choices of subservience or resistance. Countercurrents, and there are some, include significant opposition from powerful U.S. businesses, universities, and others with strong interests involving China, as well as prominent China specialists who argue for greater moderation. Thus far, the opposition has remained of secondary importance in influencing policymakers. The Biden government faces continuing problems. These are other uncertainties in coming up with an effective strategy toward China that takes into account business and other pro-China interests in the United States and also among allies and partners. Other uncertainties come from the Republican resurgence in the November elections, which placed the Biden government under greater political pressure to pay more attention to domestic issues, possibly reducing the attention devoted to China issues. It also raised the specter of a return of Donald Trump to the White House in 2024 election, suggesting to U.S. allies and partners that the systematic, measured Biden policies in seeking cooperation with allies and partners to deal with China's challenges may not last. So against these varied elements here, I nonetheless feel that bipartisan majorities in Congress are essential in, and have been essential in driving forward the kind of approach we're seeing today. They serve as ballast in steadying the ship of state as it sails forward to defend America from the Chinese onslaught. This trend will endure. In conclusion, if I could just point a few facts about the Congress here, is that many in Congress don't have the sophisticated view of understanding the overall China relationship. They see China's challenges in a wide range of ways. They only see pieces of it in many cases and don't understand the whole picture. And a sophisticated view of the whole picture is something that's just beyond them at this point. But they agree collectively to these challenges. They're trying to defend America. Are they trying to come up with a good China policy? I don't think so for the most part. They're trying to defend against these various elements that they see. So I will conclude on that, and this is bipartisan. I will conclude on that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sutter, for your comments. I now turn to Dao Wei, China Forum expert and director of the Center for International Security and Strategy, and professor of international relations at Tsinghua University. Prior to his current position, recently promoted to director, Dao Wei was the assistant president of University of International Relations, director of the Institute of American Studies, China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, CICIR. He has written hundreds of policy papers of the Chinese government and published dozens of academic papers on journals in China, the United States, and in other countries. He earned his BA and MA from UAR and his PhD from CICIR. His research expertise covers U.S. China relations and U.S. security and foreign policy. Please, the floor is yours, Director Dao Wei.
Thank you, Professor Houlden, for the moderating. And I want to thank ICAS and Professor Wu Shichun and Hong Nong for inviting me to be in this distinguished panel. It's really good to see the old friends online. So I want to start my my comments from the theme of this session, the strategic rivalry. I think Michael touched upon this issue, and he elaborated what is the strategic rivalry and why China and the US are in the strategic rivalry. Well, I agree with him to a great extent, but from China's perspective, it's hard for China to agree to use strategic rivalry to define the current status of the current relation of the two countries, because we believe that the rivalry, particularly strategic rivalry, happens between two countries are basically equal, or at least near equal, near peer. While China is rising rapidly, and also some people in China believe that the East is rising and the West is declining, but I think the mainstream view here in China is we don't believe that China is at the same level as the U.S. Probably the so-called hard power is getting closer, but China believe that the U.S. have great advantage in its soft power, institutional power, technology. So many people, I will say the mainstream view here in China is this relationship is actually the essence is the U.S. is trying to surpass China, to suppress China, trying to keep China down. Rather than a rival. I'm describing the mainstream view here in China, though I personally, maybe I don't agree with that, but I think this is a mainstream view. And we believe that the US exaggerates China's power and China's intention. And if it's, and another thing is, if we are in a rivalry, strategic rivalry, probably it also means a kind of stability, because the power position of the two rivals would be relatively stable. But we believe actually the power status of the two countries now are not that stable. And China is afraid that the US will keep China down, while the US worries that China may use new technology, new approach, new institution, try to topple down the U.S. leadership. And my second point is about the current U.S.-China relations. I think many panelists are quite pessimistic about the current U.S.-China relations. I think if you are a pessimist or optimist, it depends on how high your expectation is. My expectation toward the Biden administration or Biden-Xi era, I will say, is quite low. So with that low expectation, I will say now current status of China-US relations is much better than 12 months ago. We should not forget that 1 year ago, the chief of staff merely had to call his Chinese counterpart to promise that the US won't militarily attack China. So we were at that time literally at the brink of military conflict. But now I think we are changing the momentum. Of course, I'm not naive to believe that the China-US relations will go back to the old days. I think the new framework is still there. I think the change is basically a tactical change. But if we look forward rather than look back, maybe we will say next 2 or 3 years will be the best 2 or 3 years in next decade. Because look beyond the 2024, I don't have any reason for optimistic when I see the US domestic debate over China. As Professor Sutter pointed out, there are many bipartisan agreements in the US, in the Congress. So I don't know what kind of China strategy we will have after 2024, but it could be very difficult. I think worse than the Biden administration. So that means we may have a kind of, I'm quite reluctant to use the term window of opportunity, but we do have a window of stability. That next year, China will have the 20th Party Congress, and Of course, I think China wanted stable bilateral relations before the Party Congress. And also, I think Chinese government also want to take stable bilateral relations into one of the achievement of past 5 years or 10 years. And the US will have a midterm election, and 3 years later we'll have presidential election. I don't think the Democratic Party want to be attacked as too soft towards Beijing. I think Biden administration, generally speaking, is more professional and more professional than the previous administration. That means no matter what kind of strategy you take towards China, you will be attacked by Republican as too soft. Actually, it's not too soft, it's professional. Then you will be viewed as soft. So I think from the US perspective, from Biden administration's perspective, it will be better if we can achieve something together to show for the people of the US that a stable bilateral relations is in the interest of two countries and of the world. So the last point I want to say is next 3 years is important. We can't let the bilateral relations drift further. We have to fill in elements, just like guardrail already been mentioned several times. But I still worry that maybe the two governments' agenda may be kidnapped by some issues that not very meaningful. Two cases, I think both cases were mentioned previously. One is the Summit for Democracy. I think in Chinese, it's kind of chicken rib. It means, in China, it means it's not very tasty if you want to eat it, but it's too wasteful if you trash it. I think for me, this summit is only a delivery of the election promise, campaign promise. It's not very, actually, I don't think it's helpful for Biden administration or for the US interest. Actually, it's very divisive, not only divide China to the US, it divides the US and its allies. So I don't think it's very helpful for the Biden administration, but the Biden administration have to deliver its promise, then it did it. I think that's not good, just like withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's like deliver the promise. Another case is the so-called diplomatic boycott of Beijing Olympic. I think this is an outcome of the US domestic politics. The Biden administration has to do something because it claimed that China have committed the genocide in Xinjiang. So they have to do something, or it's not reasonable for domestic political reason. But it does not help Biden administration or the US interest while humiliate Beijing, because Beijing or Chinese people view sports and Olympic game much more important than the American people does. It's just like you trash the jewels on the crown of China. That's really a bad idea. The last case in my mind is the future arms sale to Taiwan. I don't know what kind of arms sale we will see, but the American side are talking about asymmetric deterrence, selling some offensive weapons. This kind of thing will, I think, seriously damage the bilateral relations. So with all those potential dangers and those meaningful cases, I think it's not easy for the two countries to grasp the window of opportunity of next 3 years. But I hope I'm wrong. I do want the two countries to do something to show to the audience in the two countries and to the world that we need a stable bilateral relations. It could be tense, but it needs to be stable. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Da Wei. And now turn to our final speaker, final panelist, David Feierstein. He is the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. David Feierstein is the inaugural, he is a current member of the Foundation's Board of Directors based in Austin, Texas. Prior to joining the Bush China Foundation, Mr. Firestein was the founding executive director of the University of Texas at Austin's China Public Policy Center and a clinical professor at UT Lyndon B. Johnston School of Public Affairs. He is a decorated U.S. diplomat from 1992 to 2010. He specialized primarily in U.S. China relations. Please, the floor is yours. You are muted.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gordon, for your introduction. I really appreciate it. I want to thank ICAS for inviting me to be a part of this annual conference, and specifically Chairman Swain and also Hong Nong. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a great honor to be a part of this very distinguished group. Let me just share a few thoughts that I would just sort of entitle some thoughts on a number of aspects about the U.S.-China strategic rivalry that cause me some concern, and that make me think that, as has been observed by others, that this rivalry exists and that it's going to exist for quite some time. So let me just share a few observations, and then I'll conclude, and I'll try to stay within the 7 or 8 minute time frame. Number one, I think at a structural level, there is a fundamental twin uncomfortable truth in the U.S.-China relationship that I think is one of the fundamental drivers of the rivalry that we see that exists today, and that really at some level has always existed in the modern era and will continue to exist for the lifetimes of everyone on this call. And that is this, that as viewed through an American lens, China is the only country in the world today that has the capacity to potentially negatively affect and change the American way of life. And that is true from a capacity standpoint. Whether or not China has that intention, I think, is subject of debate. As many have noted, certainly there is a widespread perception in the United States that China does intend to change America's way of life for the worse, but the capacity is there. As viewed from a Chinese perspective, the other part of this twin uncomfortable truth is the case, namely that the United States is the only country in the world that has the capacity, and in the view of some may have the intention, of terminating Communist Party rule on the mainland once and for all. Now, again, whether the United States has this intention, I think, is certainly debated. Some have noted correctly that it is not the U.S. policy to do so. But I think there's also an interesting question as to whether declared policy on behalf of any nation always and consistently reflects actual strategic thinking. But that being said, that there is a capacity there, and these twin capacities of China on the one hand and the United States on the other cause a kind of primal angst or primal anxiety that will never go away, and not only that, will get worse over time as the capabilities of both nations improve. The second point that I would make is that there are some really profound, in my judgment, misperceptions of strategic intent, I think in both directions, and I would argue probably more on the United States side looking at China. And point that I would make, and that I've made before, and that I think some would disagree with and many would agree with, is that the United States' belief that China seeks to displace and supplant the United States as the world's only superpower, as we define the term superpower, I think that is a misreading of China's intentions. But I believe that that is a widely held view in official Washington across the partisan aisle. And the point that I often make is that when we fundamentally misread the strategic intentions of the other side, we tend to adopt policies that have a higher likelihood of veering off course because they are predicated in premises that are inaccurate. And I think we see some of that certainly on the US side. I think we see some of it perhaps to a lesser degree on the Chinese side. There's more I could say, but I just want to be brief and touch on some key points here for purposes of time. The third point that I want to make is one that some of you have heard me make before, and I think it's really important to make it. And that is that one thing I think we all have to understand and recognize is a simple, hard truth. And that is that most issues currently on the US-China bilateral agenda are absolutely irreconcilable, period. We will never see eye to eye, we, the two nations, United States and China, will never see eye to eye on the issue of the validity of China's South China Sea claims, for example, or China's or the issue of Taiwan generally, notwithstanding the fact that we've papered over it for several decades with the three communiques and so on. We will not see eye to eye on human rights. We don't see eye to eye on a host of other issues. And most of these are permanently intractable and fundamentally irreconcilable. And so I hear a lot of talk in the administration, US administration, about the notion of managing competition. I think we've been managing competition pretty well for a long time. I think what we need to talk about is how do we manage irreconcilability? How do we manage the fact that we simply will never agree on any of these issues, on many of the issues on the bilateral agenda? What does that mean for the relationship? What does it mean for how we think about each other? I think that's really where the action is intellectually as far as thinking about the future of this relationship. Three other quick points before I conclude. Politics. A number of folks have, I think, very rightly and appropriately mentioned the importance of politics, particularly in the United States. But it's also true in China within the context of China's very different political system. I think it's more true here in the United States that politics has created a certain momentum in a certain direction and in a hard line direction in terms of the US approach to China. And that's for a number of reasons, but because of a couple of things. Number one, it's a lot easier to blame the foreign nation than it is to actually focus on fixing the problems that we actually have in this country. And so, you know, it's the oldest trick in the book politically, blame the foreign baddie rather than spending time addressing the much more difficult issues of infrastructure, immigration, healthcare, and so forth and so on. And we see that playing out in the United States. But more fundamentally, there is also a ratchet effect that occurs in our politics. So that once someone establishes a position and a new norm, whether it's on tariffs, whether it's on the so-called diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, it becomes politically very difficult for anyone, even those in Congress and elsewhere who may disagree, to viably come out in opposition to those positions because of the ratchet effect. Once that's the new norm, the political downside of opposing that point of view becomes is viewed as profound, and therefore it's just not worth it. The downside is there is no upside, and as a result, we ratchet toward an increasingly hardline position, even when that increasingly hardline position is not in our national interest. And so we see that playing out, I think, in the United States. Fifth point, we see a stark deterioration in US public sentiment toward China, as has been noted. China's favorables are at 20%, unfavorables are at 80%. Both of those are record numbers in the modern history, I think dating back to 1971, of US public sentiment toward China. It belies the idea that China is having any success with its so-called influence operations, because if it were, China's favorables wouldn't be at 20% and unfavorables wouldn't be at 80%, and we wouldn't have half the United States seeing China as the enemy of our nation. But in any case, those numbers are there. And of course, that creates a loop effect relative to our politics that creates a reinforcing and self-perpetuating cycle of negativity and a movement toward hardline policies. Finally, I want to just make one point before I conclude, and that is that I actually think that the gravest challenge that we face in the United States today is the untethering of American political and public policy discourse from factual reality. According to Pew and Gallup, we have 70% of the Republican Party that don't believe Joe Biden was legitimately elected president. According to Pew, we have 43% of the United States that don't believe that Sandy Hook and Parkland actually happened. We have 34% of our country, according to US pollsters, that say that they believe in all or a significant part of QAnon theory. We have got to get out of la-la land and back into the real world if we are to have any chance of outcompeting China, or more fundamentally addressing the real challenges that are in front of us as a nation. To conclude, the rivalry between the United States and China is inherent, but conflict is not foreordained. It depends on the choices that all of us make on both sides. The old relationship was largely functional, but certainly suboptimal and obviously politically unsustainable. We have to build back better the U.S.-China relationship. And to use the metaphor of Wu Shizun from right at the beginning, it's not just the United States that dug the hole. China also had its shovel and dug vigorously. Both countries have dug the hole. Both countries have a responsibility to fill it back up to some modicum of a degree. And we've got to get to a place where we have a relationship that is better than what it is today and more politically sustainable. Final point, I think our goal, both on the United States side and on the Chinese side, should be to create a U.S.-China relationship that is functional, constructive, results-oriented, mutually beneficial, and politically sustainable. Not because that is altruistic to the other side, but because it is good for all of us. I hope that's what we do as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I see questions beginning to arrive in the box here of Q&A from the audience, and of course, panelists can pose questions to others. We have approximately 30 minutes. I'd like to follow up, though, immediately on the question the point that David made, and perhaps address this to both Robert Sutter and let's start with you, Robert, perhaps. And that's a question: to what degree, following on David's comment, do you believe that U.S. domestic politics, political beliefs in the United States political system, are a barrier to management of the relationship with China?
I think it's a very good point that's been made. I would add, though, that public opinion didn't change when U.S. policies started to change and when the bipartisan majority in Congress came together and passed the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018. At that time, public opinion was very moderate toward China, as it had been for about 20 years. It didn't like the government, but it didn't want any trouble with China. That didn't change until 2020. So it wasn't public opinion that drove this change in American policy, at least in Congress. It was the calculation of the bipartisan individuals in the Congress that China was this big challenge, big danger, an agreement with the Trump administration's strategy, not Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's approach is very erratic. He wasn't consistent at all, but the strategy was, and his people were. So the point I'm getting here is that public opinion was late in coming to this, and Biden was late in coming to this. He was very moderate until 2020, January 2020. He remained moderate during the campaign. So does it keep the situation in control now, make it difficult to break out of this? I guess it does. But if they had senior leaders, I think they could persuade the public to move in different directions. I don't know how deep it is, deep the animosity is at this point. So I guess I don't put a lot of weight on public opinion as the driving force in this policy. I see the commitment in the Congress as it's related to public opinion, but I think it's related to a calculation of challenges coming from China.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Drew Fung. Both of our keynote speakers spoke, I believe, in favor of the preservation of the status quo to some degree. In other words, avoiding precipitate actions on vis-a-vis Taiwan. Is it your view that, assuming reiteration of the United States or underlining the policy of one China, etc., that do you believe that the Taiwan situation can be in effect frozen for the foreseeable future without change? Over.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Personally, I believe the Taiwan issue should be sidelined because it's not just the potentially explosive points. It also will totally, just as I mentioned, crash down our bilateral relations. On the other hand, if both sides will be getting to the military showdown of the Taiwan, then we will see some sort of achievements we got in the past more than 4 decades since the normalization. Could be just falling down overnight. Now, what's the U.S.-China relations? We're biggest trading partners in the world. We're number one, number two biggest economies in the world. We're also number one, number two biggest, carbon emitters in the world. So no matter what way we could cooperate, I think the sustainable development and peace in the world is really indispensable from the U.S.-China, even just some sort of, shallow cooperation. So that's why I think the Taiwan issue is really nightmare. We should do whatever we can to prevent from. But on the other hand, I see why the Taiwan issue become so ominously jumping up, and it becomes some sort of biggest, risk-taking points. I see a lot of a reason could be tracking back to domestic politics. So Chinese also just believe. So there's no way we can back down, because reunification with Taiwan just has a lot to do with the leadership's, their credibility and the Chinese national, pride or something like that. But on the other hand, we also see, for example, the Biden administration's Taiwan policy also now is much impact and influenced by the congressional, the mandate. So then I found, it's really, really inflammatory and disruptive. But the problems, both governments should just keep the minds sobering. We should just back down little by little. There's no way we should just tampering into the Taiwan triggered any political showdown. Otherwise, no one will benefit. So, Gordon, to be honest, I see the Taiwan issue superficially is very, very provocative. But to be honest, I don't think the China will have any, the biggest strategic change to overtake the Taiwan before the Taiwan ultimately just declare some sort of a legal independence. If the Taiwan do that, if Taiwanese do that, of course, there's no way we should just do whatever it takes. But if the Taiwan could just move around some bottom line, I don't think it will be possible for Beijing to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew Fung. I have a question for Michael Swain that's been posed. And if the panelists keep their cameras on, if you have a quick follow-on hot pursuit point to make, I can spot your hand faster than I can read the chat. But question for you, Michael Swain. Recently, apparently, you said that the U.S. may have boxed itself in by declaring the situation in Xinjiang to be genocide, and that this creates particular problems for the United States going forward, having made that declaration. What if you could respond to that question and to your, perhaps elaborate briefly on your earlier comment, if it's accurate?
Yes, I wrote in a recent opinion piece that, in commenting upon the U.S. announcement of a diplomatic boycott on the Olympics, that it had really made that kind of an action or something like it almost inevitable, because of the gravity of the charge that it made about what China is doing in Xinjiang. I mean, how can you possibly go about business as usual, as the White House spokesperson Jen Psaki recently said, when you're characterizing Chinese policies in Xinjiang as genocidal? Because that label is so pejorative, it's so extreme, it's so emotional, that the United States really has sort of boxed itself in not being able to contemplate any other alternative approaches that it might want to take in protesting that kind of behavior. I don't want to get into a long discussion here about whether Chinese actions in Xinjiang are or are not genocidal. Personally, I think the evidence for genocide as defined by the UN Genocide Convention is weak. But I certainly do believe that China is undertaking actions that you could plausibly define as crimes against humanity. And that's a pretty strong charge already, but it doesn't carry the weight of the genocide charge, which is really in a class by itself in many ways. That's what I was trying to say.
Thank you very much. Michael, I have a question for Dao Wei, and that is, to what extent do you consider, this came from one of our panelists, do you consider the BRI initiative as a serious area of contention between the two countries? China has stepped up its initiatives with countries in Europe, and some say it's trying to make inroads into NATO. Is, in fact, BRI a bone of contention? Is a problematic issue between the two countries? Please. And you're muted that way. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the BRI issue, I think it will be there and will be a contention between China and the US for foreseeable future, because I don't think, actually, from our domestic perspective, BRI is facing many difficulties in different areas in the world. But it's still a flagship initiative from Chinese government, and China will continue to push for that. And I think there's no effective alternative in the world, I think, to replace it or to compete with it. While it causing many troubles in different areas, but we do achieve something like I think the railway link China and Laos just opened, and these are the achievements. And I think it's really helpful for the local people. That's a good project. So in short, I think this BRI initiative will continue to be China's important initiative, while the West will continue to oppose it and try to compete with it. But I don't think they have the capability to achieve that. So then the contention will continue to be there, I think.
Thank you. A question for David Feierstein, and I'm going to read it. As the pandemic restricts opportunities for travel and in-person interactions, what is the future of non-governmental interactions between the US and China in this new era? How will the surge of Omicron variant impact bilateral, multilateral collaboration on global health, both in the public and private sector? I guess a broad question on terms of contacts, people-to-people contacts, as the Chinese would often say, between the US and China.
Well, it's a very good question. And I think the short answer is a one-word answer: Zoom. I think for the foreseeable future, we're all going to have to continue to engage each other in 2 dimensions rather than 3, as we're doing now. And I think that's been, the saving grace for the last couple of years, is that notwithstanding the incredible restrictions that we see around travel, many of us have been able to get together virtually and continue to engage each other and share ideas and agree, disagree, and so on. And I think now with Omicron on the scene, just when many of us were thinking and hoping that we were turning the corner in terms of getting back to some level of normalcy with respect to international travel, it appears that may still be some time off for all the understandable reasons. And so I think 2022 is probably going to be another year that at a minimum is hybrid in terms of these types of track 2 type convenings, and maybe virtually entirely virtual again in some cases. So that being said, I agree with the point that's been made. I think Michael Swain made it, and I think others have made similar points and would agree. There's incredible value to coming together in whatever format is feasible. And if that's in 2 dimensions on a flat screen, then so be it. But I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of having these types of engagements with each other. Briefly, just on the final point that you raised, Gordon, I think the notion of people-to-people exchanges, citizen exchanges, exchanges of scholars, students, and so forth, obviously that has been hampered by COVID-19. Hopefully we will get to a place where we can get those numbers back up in a sustainable and safe way to where they need to be. And I do think, going back to the keynote session, there are a number of things that we can and should do as confidence building measures that are fairly, I would say, low-hanging fruit type of issues. Getting cultural exchanges back up and running within the constraints of COVID-19, getting people-to-people exchanges back up and running, getting the Fulbright program and similar programs back up and running. These are things that are not difficult to do. And anything that stems the hemorrhaging that we see in the relationship of trust, I think would be a positive step.
Well, thank you very much, David. I will just add a personal comment. I do find that while the Track 2 dialogues, which I've been involved, are going forward, and fortunately, the virtual format is what keeps these things alive. I do miss that opportunity that one used to have for the informal getting people beyond the talking points, that informal give and take over a meal, coffee, tea break, where you could buttonhole someone and get perhaps a more frank or personal viewpoint.
I couldn't.
Thank you. A question I'm going to pose to both, first to Robert and then to Michael. Question that came from the audience, and that is, what is your view before the domestic agenda begins to dominate both the U.S. and China in 2022, U.S. midterm election, China's 20th Party Congress? Is there any low-hanging fruit or tangible outcomes that could be harvested, produce a somewhat more positive or calm narrative before the two governments shift to their domestic affairs with all that entails? Robert, please.
Yeah, it's a very hard question. I would say that the U.S. Is very domestically focused in 2021 as well. It's a fundamental factor of foreign policy is secondary, period. Domestic affairs dominates U.S. decision-making in 2021. All these different contingencies that we have and these concerns. And so I'm not sure what to suggest in this regard. I think that from the American point of view, the Chinese side has been very unmoving. There's no, they're not prepared to stop doing the challenges that they've been doing in all the areas that I mentioned. These things are ongoing; they continue, and so that's what causes these reactions on the U.S. side. So I'm not sure what to suggest, because I think it's very difficult for the president to initiate a forward movement when he runs the risk of not getting anything in return, and I think that's politically very, very difficult to do at this point. So I'm just not very optimistic. I think we're going to play out and test each other this coming year. I think this will continue. In my judgment, what we've seen.
Thank you, Robert. Michael.
Well, I have a somewhat different take on this. I mean, I think that certainly there are certain things that could occur now. Unless I'm mistaken, they could reopen the consulates that were closed. They could follow through on the understanding that supposedly was achieved during the Biden-Xi summit to reestablish journalists and to be able to have greater transparency in a variety of different areas. There was agreement on holding dialogues that were critical for both sides, and they really are talking about these talks and not actually moving forward with organizing them. And I think that needs to be done, and that could be done. There could very well be statements made that go beyond what has thus far been said regarding Taiwan. And I share very much Drew Fung's concerns about the dynamic on Taiwan, which I think is highly, highly negative. And I just think that waiting for the Chinese to sort of make the first move in a major way in order to satisfy people on the Hill is not going to in any way really alter this dynamic, because you're not going to see that unless the United States is itself prepared to take certain actions that would reassure the Chinese in some ways and undermine their own worst case assumptions about what US motives are. We have to get past this notion that one side is causing the problem in a major way because of certain nefarious things that it's doing, and it has to stop those before the relationship can, in some sense, get back to normal. This is a dynamic. Both countries are interacting on the basis of assumptions, largely of a zero-sum nature, except in some areas, that make it very hard for either side to be able to accommodate or deal with the other. And we've got to be able to get past this. We've got to be able to redefine this relationship in ways that are not just great power competition, struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, or, hey, it's win-win. We can cooperate if we just get rid of these Cold War views. Both of these are cartoonish, I think. The major threat for the United States and China is not one country that threatens the other. It is their common threat of a worsening security competition over a whole host of issues, many of which have become securitized now that shouldn't be, and the danger that that creates for both countries and for the world, and the need to focus on what really is existential in the threats that they're facing, which has to do with climate change and other major challenges to the global order that drive all kinds of problems and confrontations that really do threaten both nations in significant ways. We're just not doing that. I mean, we're just sniping at each other. We're restraining ourselves from really engaging in actions and dialogues, largely for domestic political reasons. And that if that doesn't change in some meaningful way, then we will set ourselves up for some kind of a crisis, probably over Taiwan.
Thank you. A question for Drew Fung that comes from Dennis Simon, one of the panelists, who urges said, quote, I'm going to read this. I think the biggest need right now is for formation of some type of crisis management teams on both sides. It's likely we're going to see an accident of some sort in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, etc. Some sort of crisis is not out of the question given the current situation. How will we, Beijing and Washington, deal with it without a knee-jerk reaction? Drew Fung, to you, please.
Okay, yeah. First of all, I think my answer could just follow up from Michael's idea.
Of course, please.
Most important thing is we need to reframe our bilateral relations. I mean, on what occasions or on what formality, some sort of a context, some sort of a controllable, rivalry and confrontations could be expected, and it also could be available. Otherwise, then we will see the bilateral relations is just serving completely as a tit for tat. Then no one wants to ease down and back off. Then even just some sort of such a domestic politics also will be very ominously made use of to fuel some sort of rivalry and hostilities. Then we will see our relations will be full stream into some sort of such a unexpected, escalation of the confrontations. Then if there is any single points where even just a flash of a fire is just erupts, then it will cause what? Cause overwhelmingly breakdown of our relations. So now most important thing is how to define our relations, for example, over Taiwan. Then it's a responsible competitor or it's a peaceful coexistence. We should also respect each other over some sort of such a very essential and minimal demands. For example, where the One China policy alluded on. Yeah, US acknowledge it's some sort of unfinished reunification just caused by China's prolonged domestic civil wars. But now the White House trying to shift the focus over to what? To Americans' respect and protection of Taiwan's liberty and freedom. It really got the Chinese mad. So how the Taiwan issue could be well controlled? Let's equally re-examine our counterparts or our rivals, the essential sentiments and the moods, but don't never just play the fire and just always position yourself on your some sort of self-defeating allegation. That's the Taiwan issue could be really out of some sort of such a growing dangers.
Perhaps, Robert Sutter, could I ask you to comment on the question of crisis management groups on both sides to deal with incidents that might occur, I presume here, security incidents in particular.
I think that's obviously correct. That would be very beneficial. And I do think the U.S. military is very interested in this sort of thing, to have communications. Yes, to have communications to manage these kinds of incidents that could take place. So that's ongoing, it seems to me. And so I don't think from the U.S. side, that would be a dramatic gesture or so forth. Like the U.S. military has made it clear they want to do this. So I think it's a matter of, will it happen? And I don't know if the responsibility rests on the Chinese side or not. I don't know the dynamic between the two militaries, but that's something that, from a military point of view, that's something that the Americans have said, I think, pretty directly, that they're interested in doing this kind of thing. So I don't know the situation.
Well, thank you very much. Excuse me. Now, Wei, I'd like you to speak to that question as well. I must confess, with the talk about 2024, concerns that domestic politics will dominate U.S.-China relations as we go into 2022, 2023. Do you see merit in a crisis management group as an idea, or how would you suggest that the initiative, the issues that may come up overnight, might be managed so as not to spin out of control? You're muted, Dawei, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry for that. I agree with my colleagues that I think that's a pretty good idea to set up some kind of crisis management group to control that. That said, I believe that will be quite difficult given the current political atmosphere. So it needs to be done at a very high level, probably be pushed by the two presidents. Then it will be possible. I think we badly need that, of course. But I mean, probably we need to build it at a very high level. And I think probably the most important thing is the consensus at very senior level, that once there is something happen, they can communicate directly to each other. I mean, over Taiwan, then to prevent it from spinning into something very, very big. And beyond that, I also want to say something about what we can do together. The previous question. I think actually the two sides already done something, including like visa journalist, visa business travel, and of course joint statement over climate change. I think both sides made some effort and changed their policies. I think there are a lot of things that both sides can do. For instance, the U.S. side the two sides can do together to reopen their consulate in Chengdu and in Houston. I don't know why we can't do that in a short run. And I think that the U.S. side can give more assurance to Chinese visa applicants. For instance, many IR scholar visa was revoked by Trump administration. We still don't know why. So that make many social scientists feel unsafe traveling to the U.S. even when we can reopen the border. And the Trump administration have an EO regarding the CCP members' visa. So that's observed. I don't know why we still live there, trying to restricting 90 million people, 90 million party members travel to the U.S. And of course, I think China need to do something too, like make Chinese scholar and official more convenient to meet with, for instance, diplomats, U.S. diplomats in China or their counterparts in the U.S. and trying to help the U.S. diplomats do their own job in China, or journalists to do their job in China. I think these are the things that we can do on our side. I mean, the two sides have to do it together.
Thank you. Michael Swain has flagged that he is involved in crisis management issues. I wonder, Michael, if you could make a very quick comment on crisis management. Then I'd like to turn to David Feierstein. Economics has been largely absent from this discussion. I know that David holds strong views on tariffs, but first to you, Michael.
Yeah, I'll be really quick, Gordon. There is a crisis communication dialogue that exists now between the senior US and Chinese militaries. It hasn't progressed terribly far, but it has achieved certain outcomes in discussions about certain understandings about what is crises, what is crisis management, etc. But it does need to go a lot further, not just with the military, but as Da Wei suggested, it really has to get recognized, not just by senior leaders, but recognize that civilian leaders on both sides need to understand crisis perceptions that each side holds towards the other, certain sets of assumptions about or images of the other side and how they behave in a crisis. This is not just about operator to operator, sort of ship captain to ship captain when there's an incident at sea. It's really much more about, although those are important to keep a hold and keep a cap on something from escalating, it's also very much about how leaders look at each other in a crisis. And we don't have enough understanding about those issues in both the United States and China, but we do have groups in both countries that want to improve that understanding.
Nice to have a positive note there. Thank you for that, Michael. Now to you, David, the economic trade relationship has been absent from this conversation. I know you have something to say, particularly on tariffs. The floor is yours. This is the final comment. Thank you.
Gordon, thanks. Yeah, just on tariffs. I mean, as was noted by Minister Xu at the outset, the tariffs are another issue that could easily be, not politically easily, but technically easily, in a sense, de-escalated. The tariffs are hurting both sides. We all know that. We know the data. We know that Trump was the deficit president in American history. He had the largest average annual merchandise trade deficit with China of any president in history. And that's an average number across the presidency so that we can compare apples to apples with other presidencies. The policies failed. They failed to achieve their stated objectives. They've hurt consumers. They've killed jobs, and they've done nothing to solve any of the problems on the agenda. And I could go on, but the bottom line is that is obviously an easy issue where all we need to do is what is in our interest as a nation and get back to pro-business, pro-market, pro-globalization policies that were embraced on both sides of the partisan aisle for the last several decades by presidents all the way back to George H.W. Bush, then Clinton, then George W. Bush, then President Obama, then President Trump. The bottom line is we are starting to take plays from the Chinese playbook in terms of central planning and telling companies where they can produce, where they can source. It's not how we got to be the number one power in the history of the world, the number one economic power, the number one innovation and technology power. And it's a bad roadmap for America. We've got to get back to the things that made us the strongest economy in the world history in the first place. And the last thing I'll say is, oftentimes when I give a talk, the most controversial thing that I ever say is that I am pro-globalization, period. Globalization works. Globalization has not failed. What has failed is the U.S., speaking about the United States, the U.S. domestic political response to the extraordinary wealth and prosperity that globalization has in fact generated. And the fault lies at the feet of American lawmakers and leaders, including in the executive branch, for not allocating the benefits of global trade and the prosperity generated from global trade in a way that was perceived as equitable and politically sustainable in our political context. That was the point of failure, not globalization. Comparative advantage works. We've got to get back to those ideas, and we have to stop doing things that hurt us. And as I put it during the Trump era, hurt America first, hurt America worst is not a smart policy. We've got to get away from it.
Thank you very much, David. And I would say as a final comment, as moderator from a third country, I watch with great interest and concern, as does the whole world, the management of this key relationship. We're not going to have solved the issues today. And I apologize actually for some of the questions that were posed could not be answered. But this is unfortunately, a growth industry, management of this difficult relationship. And I wish both America and China well. We all will suffer or benefit from how well this goes forward. I'd like to thank the ICAS, Institute for China-America Studies, in particular Hong Nong, and also Wu Sun of the Advisory Institute on which I sit. Thank you for your contributions and your efforts. Over to you, Nong, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gordon Houlden. You are such a great time manager. And I'd like to thank all our panelists for your great contribution to the discussion. We heard many of the worrisome facts from both sides, and we also heard the trajectory development in the coming years. And I really appreciate your contribution. I hope in the next year's annual conference, we will be able to find a new term to rephrase rivalry and to define the bilateral relations.